Today we're going to talk about Imperfect. So, Imperfect is a psychological horror game. It's a first-person single-player game, and it's about the story of a man who's imperfect, who's flawed, dealing with a lot of sort of heavy themes, and it's not a walking simulator. It's a real game with real mechanics, which I love walking simulators actually, but. What we're talking about today is kind of why I chose this art style that I did. So we'll sort of go back to look at a few things about Imperfect. This is the art style in question. So the art style is using the art of the famous artist Gustave Doré, and we'll talk about that more in a little bit. It's using the textures and the artistry and the artistic intention behind his work from the 1860s. And it's reframing it in a new context and a new story. So we'll look at this a little bit more later, and so I'll kind of move on from that. Here's some gameplay of the game. This was from a couple months ago. I've since added first-person animations, character animations, so it's a lot nicer looking now, but you get the idea. Basically, we have some puzzles. They're kind of about manipulating these light embers and using them to power things, and then we have sort of these anti-gravity powers that open up a lot of emergent gameplay in the space. And all the mechanics is kind of a focus on them being metaphorical for the story. So the mechanics sort of serve the story, become something that you engage in that helps you understand more of what's happening in the game. So we'll move on from there. Here's some screenshots of the game just to get you an idea. Gameplay takes place in sort of two major areas. One is in this sort of mysterious place that is very questionable whether you're potentially dead or not, or you're in purgatory, or who knows, maybe we'll never answer it, maybe we will. And that's kind of this sort of one part of the gameplay. And the other part of the gameplay takes place in a more realistic world that includes these kind of like visions or flashbacks to your life and the things and the reasons that you got there. So there's kind of a lot visually going on in the game. We want to try and the goal is to kind of keep it visually consistent throughout while maintaining this contrast and this juxtaposition. So Imperfect started with a story that I wrote. It's a short story originally. Sort of this character study about an imperfect man, somebody who has made mistakes, and your place in the universe. And through this sort of created this twisty, pulpy thriller plot, kind of Coen Brothers type plot, where just a lot of things go down, a lot of people get involved, everybody's pretty messed up, and everything goes really not according to plan. Everyone's sort of acting with their wounds and acting with their brokenness in the world, and that's kind of what the story was about. And there's this sort of heavy dose of mystery in the supernatural, where there's a lot of questions of whether things are supernatural or explainable, and a lot of sort of paranormal questions as well. So the mechanics of the game also is all about learning to survive in this dark and dangerous landscape, looking for some sort of redemption, and the puzzles and platforming are how that mostly plays out. It's kind of focused on using puzzles and platforming to increase and decrease tension throughout the game. So the question when I'm looking at this kind of design for a game, which I sort of had played out, it's like, okay, I want to have this kind of story and I want mechanics that support that story. Is what's the aesthetic that I would go with, right? So how do I choose an aesthetic for something that's so, how do we choose an aesthetic for any game, right? Well, I had some constraints. First of all, it needed to provide a dark, foreboding mood. I knew that was going to be something I needed, but I needed it to contrast well with these kind of flashback memory sequences. Secondly, it needed to allow for mostly solo development. I'm a designer. I do code. I do the design. I even do the music for Imperfect. So it's a pretty big undertaking to do all the stuff at once. The game's going to be about 2 hours or so for the first chapter. There may be up to 7 chapters. So, this is not, it's somewhat bite-sized. It's what I'm creating. But still, something needs to be created that can do solo development. And then we need a unique look, obviously, because really want to create something that's super generic, and we want to make sure we stand out. The horror genre is certainly a permeated genre full of similar-ish looking games, right? So it's all about trying to create something that's a little bit unique. And so I've always been a fan of Gustave Doré. I'm a metalhead. I was in a metal band in college, and his art is a huge influence on a lot of metal art. And also, I've just always been interested in the themes that he illustrated in Paradise Lost, Divine Comedy. The work that he chose to illustrate has always been some of my favorite literary work. And so Gustave Doré has always been on my radar. And here are some of the books that, since I've started creating Imperfect, I have purchased. They're all illustrated books that have good high resolution versions, and unfortunately I've had to tear a lot of them up to take things out of them, but I might just have to buy a whole new fresh copies now because I had to tear them up to scan them. But the books, Gustave Doré was incredibly prolific. He in the 1860s in France illustrated thousands and thousands of things. He was very fast, and he had a very good team of people working for him doing etchings, wood carving, etchings, and inking. And so let's look at some of that work. Some of the most famous things that he did were from Paradise Lost and Divine Comedy. And all of these were done, some of them are actually quite small, and then scanned in, which is actually kind of a secret to one of his success at times, is how small they were actually. You could get a lot of detail in with a fairly small size. But you can see that you may have seen some of these pieces, depictions of these fictional worlds, of these kind of like metaphorical spaces, of archetypical people from like you have depictions of Satan falling from the heavens in Paradise Lost, depictions of the fallen, the damned people in hell, and biblical concepts of like the end of the world and the apocalypse and things like that. And you could see, of course, every Iron Maiden cover was just like, let's do that, right? They never quite got there. But this is a huge kind of, even if you aren't aware specifically of Gustave Doré, you're probably aware of some of these pieces that are very famous, and he was massively prolific. And if you're not aware of him, then you're definitely aware of the people who imitate him today, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So why do this? Why bring in a whole other artist's work and just use that for my work? Is that weird? Is that cheating? What is it? Well, it actually just fit all of my things, and it provided some nice bonuses. So it does provide the dark and foreboding mood. Need that. It allows for really slow development because it does not eliminate the work. Of course, it would be cheating if it did. If I just I don't know. I feel like it'd be lame if I just took the etchings and then made a little 2D game on top of them. Although maybe that could be cool. But I'm using them. I'm transforming them very strongly. But it does allow to save a lot of time. I don't have to work with an artist to hand create these sort of illustrative textures. It gives the game a unique look, but it also has three other things I want to kind of focus on, which is that it does leverage this sort of pre-existing artistic meaning. The things that Doré was illustrating, they are also themes that exist in my work, in my story. So it gels nicely. Secondly, it leverages any existing fan base that Doré or artists like him have, and it's a style that people are interested in. It's not hugely popular, which is good because it's hard to stand out in the massive popular, right? And then also it's just inspiring. There's been so many times where in reading the source material, learning about Doré, learning about the story of Paradise Lost or things like that, I was inspired to create certain parts of the story. And so it's just nice to be involved and connected with something that adds that. So themes, some of my main themes in my game are like morality, isolation, the idea of atonement, And it's critical that those themes match with the source work with Doré, and of course they do, especially with Divine Comedy and with Paradise Lost, but also the Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner has a lot of those kind of themes. And the Crusade illustrations are dealing a lot with those kind of themes as well. So they're just everywhere in his era of work. And so this allows that pre-existing kind of meaning to enhance. Secondly, the fan base. The fan base exists. It's decent size. People repost Doré. Doré has an Instagram. I don't think he posts because he's not here anymore. But someone decided they wanted to make a Doré Instagram. Which, here's a tip: if you want to get a good Instagram following, just find a dead artist, pretend that you're them, and start posting. So there's a lot of famous artists. Michael Ulrich is a really big artist right now. He does stuff for like Post Malone and stuff, and he's a big tattoo artist, and he uses Doré sort of as a big inspiration. So that's kind of an existing thing. At least it gives me something, and I like to exist a little bit outside of gamer culture. I like to attract people who are in art, who are in design, and I like to do that because I think that sometimes gamer aesthetics are incestuous and just sort of self-perpetuating, but also valuable. And so I kind of have to write a balance. It's also inspiring, some of the imagery in the Divine Comedy of these submerged figures lurking in this icy crystalline lake inspired my first playable environment, which I'm still working on nailing a look for it. But here's some of the shots of where it is right now. This sort of hopeless, sunken creatures at the end of their failed journey to redemption. I sort of want to create this idea of hopelessness and lurking below. So that's kind of been an interesting inspiration. Here's some gameplay of that, kind of dealing with those creatures. There's part of the game is sort of an idea that you can actually swim around under here, and it's meant to be kind of a horrific experience because obviously you can't see anything. And sort of swimming around in here, manipulating some levers and things, and you get some pretty creepy sort of jump scares that happen when you're under there. So the kind of like the tone of those illustrations would inspire to a certain degree to create a sense of dread that fits with that general idea. So also his depiction of the sacred and profane forests are a big inspiration for the next chapter, which will be taking place in a large and detailed forest, and we'll sort of be taking a lot from this and pulling textures and stuff like that. And also just thematically inspiring. So this is a statue of Apollo of Belvedere, who's it's a very famous statue. This is a 3D scan of that statue with the Doré textures put onto it. And it's in the game. It's sort of the initial central figure that you see when you walk into the first area of the game. And Apollo, the story is that Apollo is sort of slaying the giant world serpent, and in this statue, he's missing the bow, and always has been for a very long time. And there's this discussion that he's like sort of this godlike figure who's missing his weapon, and that's a metaphorical thing that exists in my game about sort of like creating our own gods and how we're missing. They're missing the power they need, and this idea of incompletion or imperfection is in the game narratively. And so, if Apollo is, Doré didn't specifically ever illustrate Apollo of Belvedere or anything, but this is the way that I like to imagine Doré would have treated him, in a sense, putting him in a space that means what it does in the game, which, of course, when you play the game, you'll understand that more deeply. But here's the actual statue next to the statue in the game. And so that's kind of a fun thing to be doing, because if you look at Doré's work, you're seeing like he's using tons of historical figures. I mean, you have Virgil, and you have like all these different figures that are sort of part of the canon, and Socrates, and part of the canon of history. And he's using them and illustrating them. So I'm doing the same thing with sort of like Apollo Maybe I'll use more modern figures. Maybe Bezos will make his way in there. I don't know. All right, so let's talk about the actual art process itself. We'll get a little bit more. Um, we'll get a little bit more specific about how things are and how they're done. So again, this is sort of the look of the game. As you can see, we've got a lot going on in terms of using the actual textures from Doré. And let's talk about the specific methods that I used. So there's 4 main methods that I used to create the illustration style. 1, I use tileable textures. 2, 3D object wrapping. 3, I use backdrops. And 4, I use details. So what I mean by this is, so tileable textures. This video sort of breaks down the process, and I'll also sort of talk over it. Tileable textures are my bread and butter, really, because my main process is I take the books, I scan them in, and once I've scanned them in, I'm looking for sort of like archetypical textures that I need for my game. So in the case of this illustration example, I'm looking for this piece. I'm going to scan it in. I scan them in at massive resolution. They're like 1200 DPI. Now, of course, I'm still limited by the resolution of the paper, the way that the book was printed. But, I don't have access to the original Doré etchings. I don't know that I would have gotten a much better result even if I did. So what I get, though, is a very high resolution scan from like an illustration like this. And then I create the tileable texture by using classic tileable texture techniques, cloning, and doing my classic Photoshop filter offset and all that, right? And I just make it by hand, and I try to keep as much of the original artistry as I possibly can. So here's the two kind of next to each other. If I can keep the original artistry, that's because I'm not as good an artist as Doré is, right? And so the point of this is to bring as much of him into this as possible. Who knows what part of it will really just sell it? So I try to keep as much as possible. But of course, when I'm making tileable, there's going to be moments where I have to clone. Here you can see like a little piece there and piece there. There's going to be moments where I have to clone things or mess things or even come in with a black brush and slightly re-illustrate something. But I try to keep that to a minimum. So I create the tileable textures, and then they go on to the models. And this is how I get most of my texture into the world, because, of course, this is the most flexible, right? As game devs, we know that. And then I'll lay stuff like decals over them to break them up, just like normal game dev process, right? Here's another one. So this rock texture is pulled right from this illustration. Sometimes they get muddy in spots. There may even be some that I go back and touch up one day where there's like kind of fadey, muddy spots. That's really not as good as it could be in some areas. But I try to look for generally different feels so that I can create distinctly different feelings. So this is for this certain kind of a rock, right? And then here, this one's from a cliff face, so I got this nice linear texture here. Able to use that. I actually didn't use it for a cliff, although I could still use it for a cliff. This I use for my ground right now in some spots. So I can kind of have this like cracked ground. And then is another cliff face. This one's a little bit darker, more like sinister. I have that in some of my darker areas. So I try to use them as a palette that I progressively change over the course of the experience. Here's one that's more detailed, like rock faces, and I had to really kind of weave this in, pull it from a couple different images. But this one's good for those more detailed, sort of like rocky walls. So I get some variety. I still have a good amount more to make, and there's more than this. But the goal here is to just create something that I can reuse. And one of the things the challenges that I actually have had here is that when you're close to this, it may look good, but far away it wouldn't, or vice versa, because of how much detail is there. So I've created a shader that basically fades. Many games have this, right? Where you have just a simple shader that you just pull back and you're going to see less tiling. and then when you get close, it'll tile it more. That was a big solution for me, because the this much detail far away would be very, very, very dense and difficult to watch. Right. So that's kind of something that we've done here. So the next technique is 3D object wrapping. This method sort of brings really detailed and specific elements from the world into this one. And so, this example here in this video is talking about how I use that same tileable texture, but I use it to generate an actual asset that was made of brick, right? And so this is another common game. See, I'm not really reinventing the wheel at all. I'm just using the context a little differently, right? Another classic game modeling concept of starting with a texture, but it's an example of how I can use that texture as something that I model. And then I'll do some scripting in Unreal and set it up so that I can animate it and create a whole sort of like asset with some multiple different options. And then now I have those sort of like sewer assets, right? And, doing a modeling that wraps the texture around allows me to bring in very detailed objects. So here's an example of a super detailed object like this column. This one more than this one, because this one's really lacking detail. This one has way more on the right there. But so I made a texture atlas out of several columns from several different illustrations, and use those to model too. So here's the first column in the world, and then here's a little asset, and its poly count is pretty low because it has so much detail built into the illustration, right? And this one's probably the highest poly one that I have, which is, it's fairly low, not too low. But and the great thing is that the LODs hold up great on these, because when you pull back, you're just still seeing the great illustrated texture, and it's basically I don't use a lot of tricks. I don't have normal maps. I don't have anything except maybe an occasional roughness map when I need it. I don't have height maps. At some point I had displacement, but I removed it. It just didn't make sense or work. It just didn't really work for me. So, I'm kind of dealing with like a pretty strong basis I'm just basing it only on the value of the image. I'm not using a lot of physically based rendering techniques except just sort of basic roughness. And so that means that my style is really dependent on how good these textures look, which is great because they already look great because they come right from amazing illustrations, right? So you would love to have an artist who could design and draw like an awesome lion head or something, right? And so here's another one from another illustration. Pull these columns out. I'm just always looking through these Doré books, looking for architectural elements, looking for things that I want to put in my world. And here's the asset and how it looks in the world as well. And of course, I use it for different varieties. Each of these columns have like different broken versions and rubble, and so I get a lot of mileage out of them. Then another example is this sort of transom detail. I used this plus the general wall texture here to create some of my architectural assets. And so I create stuff like this, which is just like a piece, big blocky piece that you walk on like a bridge. And, just super helpful to have that detail. And, the way that it's shaded already, I don't need a normal map or anything like that for this to feel really good. It's already shaded very nicely and built, which is something I actually really do have to think about, though. It's sort of a challenge here. If you actually go back, if we notice this one here, if you look at these columns, see how they have a lot of shading already on them. So because this is, it's part of the illustration. This is in shadow and this is in light. This is in shadow. This is in light, right? I don't know if you actually can see my mouse. You probably can. And so because there's value already in these, I have to, without destroying the image, try to flatten them out as much as I can. You can see here, this extracted version does not have as much deep shadow as this did. And that's because I'm relighting these, right? So if I'm relighting them, I don't need to have inbuilt shadow. I'm not dealing with a 2D image anymore. And they're wrapping around 3D objects. So, and it still kind of happens in some spots that, yeah, you can see it right here, actually. See, there's like a little, a shadow, like a highlight where it really wouldn't be. I don't think it ruins it, but it is somewhat irritating. It's sort of something, one of the bugaboos with working with this kind of a style, where it's basically, you have this line, and that's because the inbuilt shading wrapping around a cylindrical object just sort of comes that way. All right, so let's move on. So my next technique was backdrops. So the idea of using big images from Doré's work to be used as large backdrops. I'll use them for skyboxes, for distant imagery, anything that I just really want to use a whole Doré piece. And I'll only use a whole Doré piece if it's very meaningful to the story. I'm not just ripping things. Now, I do have moments where I might take just mountains or something and use them, but I won't use the whole composition unless it makes sense. Now, in this case, this is the entrance to hell. And I'm not saying that the character's in hell, but they're somewhere. But this is where they are, right? And so this is being used in one of the main areas as a big backdrop in the first area that you kind of go into. So it's kind of like it's cueing you off. And of course, no one understands that. That's not maybe two Doré nerds who play this game will ever get it. But it's still important. It's important to do things that have deep meaning, because the thought is that one day if somebody actually cares, then they'll actually find something beyond just the aesthetic. They'll find a meaning. They'll find something that you're not just appropriating another person's art, that you're using it for its thematic consistency. And yeah, it's been in development on basically for a year, since around a year. Actually about a year now. Yeah, last September. So a little over, but during that time I got married and bought a house, and so things were a little slow. Things are picking up now. So the backdrops, that's kind of like the big move, but a rare move in the game. And here's that asset. And I also take them and do a little bit of sculpting around them so they have some dimensionality. They're not just 2D images. So I do like a plane with a little bit of sculpting to kind of keep them, to let the light fall on them in a way that makes sense and have some dimension. So the last thing is details. So I try to use Doré's work even in the small details. And so here's an example. This is the one of the embers. It's a particle effect, and I pulled the stars from the sky from the Paradise Lost. So using that, I'm not very happy with this particle effect yet, but it's getting there. And basically using that kind of like from there is just another way of adding that deep meaning and using the details. Another big way is I'm using this the angel from a Crusade illustration, which is this guiding angel in the night that sort of like leads the Crusaders, and that's a thematic role for the character of Dora, who it's being used for. So this is her. She kind of watches you and leaves you notes for you to read. Classic survival horror game style. Never likes to talk. She just likes to leave little notes. And then, but she has on her back this illustration of this angel because she sort of fits this role a little bit. Sort of a terrifying angel. All right. So I think that's it. Here's my socials if you want to follow me. You can wishlist on Steam for the almighty algorithm. And so any questions?
A lot of great stuff there. If you have questions and you're a GGDA member, we're going to move Walter into our general chat in Discord. So jump in there. Great stuff. Great looks. A lot of good feedback. More praise and questions in chat.